So this will be for you. Okay.
Good morning. Welcome to Johns Hopkins SAIS. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Center for Transatlantic Relations here at the School of Advanced International Studies. We're delighted and gratified so many people here joining us today on our conference on forging a transatlantic consensus on Russia. We have a very good day in front of us with many high-level participants and discussants, very good audience, and we're delighted to kick it off with Senator McCain, we'll turn to in a minute. I'd like to thank our partners at the Institute of Eastern Studies in Poland. This is an annual event that we do this time of year with them. They are really a premier think tank in Central Europe on issues related to Eastern Europe and Russia, and are great partners for us. And I'd like to introduce Robert Gray from the Institute.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Institute for Eastern Studies. It is the second consecutive year we've been co-organizing the Transatlantic Conference in cooperation with the School of Advanced International Studies, the Center for Transatlantic Relations. Last year we concentrated on forging a US-EU partnership. Throughout the sessions and informal meetings, there was a consensus that if the transatlantic partnership is to be a progressive force in the world to come, Americans and Europeans must urgently build a strategic partnership that is more effective in dealing with partners and addressing transformations. A lot of attention was devoted to the Russian Federation and challenges that the trilateral US-EU-Russia dialogue needs to face. These findings encourage us to continue search for ways to forge a transatlantic consensus on Russia. I hope you will find all the sessions and informal discussions constructive, and that will encourage you to influence and shape the transatlantic consensus on Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the forum.
So I want to welcome all of our guests here from Europe. We have distinguished guests from Russia with us, as well as from other European countries, and that's the nature of the event today, as well as many friends from the United States. So we're going to kick off. I can't think of a better way to kick off than with our opening speaker. My colleague Kurt Volker is going to introduce Senator McCain, and then we'll begin.
Thank you very much. And first, let me give all of you a welcome, and especially, Senator, a welcome to you from the Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies, Jessica Einhorn. She can't be here this morning, but she asked that we pass on our regards. Let me also thank you for coming, and thank all of you, and thanks to Dan and Robert. 16 years ago, I was working at the U.S. Embassy in Budapest, Hungary. We were at that time helping Hungary to prepare for its eventual membership in NATO. And we had a visit from a staffer from the U.S. Senate. He was at the time the National Security Advisor for the Majority Leader, Trent Lott, Randy Schuneman. And after spending 2 or 3 days together getting around Hungary and seeing everything, Randy turned to me and said, "What are you doing after this?" And I said, "Well, I really don't know." And he said, "Well, you should come back and work in the Senate. It's a great experience for a Foreign Service officer." And so I thought, well, why not? I'll go ahead and do that. So I came back, and he had me interview in the Office of Senator McCain. Being a prudent diplomat and Foreign Service officer, I said, well, I should interview somewhere else too. So my counsel is sitting here, set me up to interview with Senator Joe Biden. You can question my judgment, but in the end I decided that it would be a privilege to work for Senator McCain, which I did for a year from 1997 to 98. It was a great opportunity, an eye-opener as a diplomat to see the legislative side of our foreign policy process. But even more than that, it was a tremendous personal opportunity to really become acquainted with the great American. Senator McCain has had an extraordinary life, an extraordinary career, as all of you know, from his time as a rebellious Navy cadet to a participant in Vietnam, not under the most pleasant of circumstances. to a congressman and then a senator. He's just won re-election to the Senate for, if I count correctly, the 5th time. It's quite an achievement, and I can only imagine what a freeing experience that must be to have come through that with 6 years ahead of you. But it's also a time of great challenge for our country. And I can't think of anyone better who has been through as much as he has to give us his perspective on the challenges we face abroad, even as we deal with challenges at home. One of the hallmarks of Senator McCain's contribution to our foreign policy and national security policy has been a steadfast commitment to values, to freedom, to democracy, to rule of law, human rights, even when it has gone against the grain, whether it's been popular in his own party or not, or whether it has won him votes or not. And I think that is really the greatest contribution that anyone could make on foreign policy, is to hold us all account to our higher angels and our higher aspirations. He's going to speak to us today about our relationship with Russia, but I know that fits into a much wider context about America's foreign policy today. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you Senator John McCain. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kurt, for another gracious introduction. As Kurt mentioned, he was kind enough to introduce me here a year ago, and I look forward to coming back as often as possible to this very important institution where the most important issues of the day are not only discussed, but solutions are found as well. I want to thank Jessica Einhorn and all the leadership of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for the opportunity to return again, as I mentioned. As you know, one of the final things the Senate may consider during the lame duck session is the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with the Russian Federation, or New START. I still hope we'll be able to bring this up next week, and a lot of work is being done to that effect. My colleague, Senator John Kyle, is doing a tremendous job working with the administration to resolve the issues associated with nuclear modernization. I've been focusing my efforts on addressing the key concerns related to missile defense. I think we are very close to agreements. With so much focus now on one aspect of our Russian policy, this is a good time to pull back and reflect on this relationship more broadly. The administration has been quite clear that New START is a key component of its so-called reset policy, its effort to forge a more constructive relationship with Russia based on mutual interests and respect. It is a fine idea in principle, and I do not deny that it has borne some modest results, including New START. Nonetheless, I remain a bit skeptical about how far this attempted reset will get us with the current Russian government. And to help illustrate my point, I'd like to read an excerpt from a joint declaration issued recently by the U.S. and Russian heads of state, and I quote, "We affirm that the era in which the United States and Russia considered one another an enemy or strategic threat has ended. Rather, we are dedicated to working together with other nations to address the global challenges of the 21st century, moving the U.S.-Russia relationship from one of strategic competition to strategic partnership. We will strive to identify areas of positive cooperation where our interests coincide while minimizing the strain on our partnership where our interests diverge. Going forward, we intend to deepen our cooperation wherever possible while taking further, even more far-reaching steps to demonstrate our joint leadership in addressing new challenges to global peace and security." Again, I share the sentiments and aspirations of a statement like this. The problem is it was issued on April 6, 2008 by George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin. 4 months later, Russia invaded Georgia. Again, I share those views. But the point is that this administration's effort to reset U.S. relations with Russia, however well-intentioned, isn't new. The Clinton administration and then the Bush administration each came into office thinking that its predecessor had mishandled Russia. They each thought they would finally unlock what many assumed to be the untapped potential of U.S.-Russia relations. Each administration tried in its own way to reset this relationship. The Bush administration even tried to, in its own way, the Bush administration even tried at least twice, by my count. Ultimately, each administration oversold the benefit of cooperation with Russia and then under-delivered on it. And now, here we are in the midst of yet another attempt to reset U.S.-Russia relationship. For 2 decades, the question has been asked repeatedly: how can the United States forge a constructive global partnership with Russia? It still isn't clear. So perhaps it's time to start asking some different questions, such as, do the United States and Russia actually share as many interests as we would hope? Is Russia really as relevant to today's global challenges and as capable of helping to resolve them as our repeated significant investments in this relationship would warrant? And perhaps most of all, how effectively and reliably can we cooperate with a Russian government whose values are so increasingly antithetical to ours? Now, this is not to say that Russia is forever destined to be an enemy of the United States, as some members of my own party have recently seemed to suggest. What it is to say is that Russia has not developed as we had hoped, and that perhaps the actual prospects of our relationship with Russia have too often been exaggerated. Just look at the New START Treaty. It is a modest accomplishment, but it's been so overhyped that you'd think it's the administration's most important foreign policy success to date, and that its ultimate ratification would be so consequential as to tip the balance of power within the Kremlin to America's favor. What we need most now is a greater sense of realism about Russia, about the recent history of our relationship, about the substantial limitations on Russian power, about the divergences in U.S. and Russian interest, and about the lack of shared values between our governments. We don't need WikiLeaks to reach these conclusions, my friends. They've been staring us in the face for a long time. Realism about Russia first requires a proper understanding of recent history. Despite multiple U.S. efforts to reset its relations with Russia after the Cold War, the myth persists that America bears much of the blame for Russia's behavior, for allegedly lecturing and hectoring Russia, treating it as a vanquished enemy, and expanding NATO over Russia's objections. Facts, however, are stubborn things. In actuality, the United States has provided Russia with $9 billion in assistance since 1992 to support its political and economic modernization. At our insistence, Russia has had a seat at the table in every NATO summit but one since 2002. And U.S. leaders have spent countless hours with their Russian counterparts trying to resolve many contentious issues, from Kosovo to missile defense. What recent administrations have been guilty of is over-personalizing their Russia policies. Too often, we seem to have pinned our hopes on a single Russian leader. We seem to have mistaken a chummy relationship with one man, dare I say, after looking into his eyes and getting a sense of his soul, for a transformed relationship with Russia itself. So first there's Bill and Boris, then there's George and Vladimir. And now I worry that we are repeating this mistake yet again and setting ourselves up for another disappointment, especially if the man on which we are wagering so much is no longer president in 2012. Realism about Russia also requires a recognition that it is no longer a great power. It is a declining power, which can certainly shape events in its region, but has a far more limited ability to play a leading role in resolving global challenges. There are many reasons for Russia's declining influence. Its demographic base is collapsing. Its national cohesion is threatened by a host of separatist movements and domestic insurgencies. Its ability to project power, real military power, barely extends beyond the Eurasian landmass. Its economy is still predominantly dependent on hydrocarbons, and therefore subject to volatile expansions and contractions in global energy prices. Its political system is rotten and predatory, and the only thing it seems to do with any great efficacy is systematically misappropriate national resources and foreign investment on behalf of a quasi-criminal ruling syndicate. In its annual index of perceptions of corruption, Transparency International ranked Russia 154th out of 178 countries, perceived as more corrupt than Pakistan, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. More and more economists and investors are arguing that Russia no longer belongs in the company of Brazil, India, and China as one of the BRIC economies, because corruption in Russia is now so malignant that it has begun to deter even the most risk-tolerant foreign investment. Russia's decline is a human tragedy, but it's also a geopolitical reality. Put simply, Russia is becoming less and less capable of being a meaningful partner for the United States. Instead, the broader challenge we may face with Russia could be less the projection of its success than the management of its failure. Realism About Russia also demands a recognition that Russia's interests, as defined by its present government, differ from ours in some rather considerable ways. To be sure, there are areas of convergence, and I credit the administration for making some progress in these places, not just signing New START, but also gaining Russia's agreement to pass new UN sanctions against Iran and North Korea, to stop its sale of S-300 air defense missiles to the Iranian government, to open its territory to U.S. resupply efforts for our operations in Afghanistan, and to work more closely on certain counterterrorism and intelligence sharing activities. That said, even these limited moves by Russia have been near-run things, and there remain serious concerns about what was given or promised to the Russians in return. Furthermore, nearly every positive step the Russian government has taken thus far could be walked back at a moment's notice. Arms sales to Iran that were turned off can easily be turned on. Resupply corridors that were open can be easily closed. Sanctions that were passed can easily be left unenforced. Intelligence that can be shared can just as easily be withheld. And to think, this is the relatively easy stuff, the issues on which our interests converge. What mostly lies ahead is the hard stuff, the issues where our interests diverge. So, for example, whereas the United States has an interest in improving and deploying our missile defenses in Europe, Foreign Minister Lavrov has called these systems, quote, absolutely inadmissible, and threatened to pull out of New START if we do so, whereas we have an interest in beginning negotiations with Russia to reduce its stockpiles of tactical nuclear weapons, which are nearly 10 times larger than ours. Russia is increasingly relying on those weapons as a part of its military doctrine, as recent news reports may suggest. Whereas we have an interest in an open global energy market, Russia still uses its oil and gas as political weapons. And whereas we support the independence and territorial integrity of Russia's neighbors, Russia still treats those sovereign nations as part of its old imperial stomping grounds. The most glaring example of this remains Georgia. Over 2 years after its invasion, Russia not only continues to occupy 20% of Georgia's sovereign territory, it's building military bases there, permitting the ethnic cleansing of Georgians in South Ossetia, and denying access to humanitarian missions and monitors, all in violation of Russia's obligation under the ceasefire agreement negotiated by President Sarkozy. Despite this constant threat, Russia is deepening its democracy and growing its economy. The World Bank considers Georgia the 12th best place in the world to do business. Russia is 123rd. In a major recent step, President Saakashvili even renounced the use of force to end Russia's occupation, pledging only to defend non-occupied Georgia in the event of a Russian attack. And how did the Russian government respond? Aggressively and dismissively. Russia's ongoing occupation of Georgia points to one final reason for realism about Russia: the fact that this government does not share our values. Indeed, it is deeply hostile to our values. Now, this doesn't mean that we cannot or should not work with Russia where possible. The world doesn't work that way. What it does mean, however, is that our engagement with Russia must always be checked by the recognition that this is a government that steals from, lies to, and assaults its own citizens with virtual impunity. So imagine how it will treat us. Today is Human Rights Day, so there's no better time to affirm our special obligation to speak up for justice, democratic values, and individual rights in Russia. President Medvedev speaks often and at times eloquently about the need for Russia to be governed by the rule of law and to finally reckon with what he has called Russia's legal nihilism. And yet Russia under Medvedev's administration seems to be just as mired in legal nihilism as ever, perhaps more so. Take the tragic cases of Russia's last remaining independent journalists. A month ago, one Russian journalist who covered political movements and protests was beaten by attackers who broke his jaw, both his legs, and many of his fingers, a clear political message to other writers. No one has been charged for this crime. Another journalist who exposed corruption was attacked last year and left for dead, with brain damage so severe that he can no longer speak. He too had his fingers smashed, 3 of which had to be amputated, as did one of his legs. No one has been charged in this case either. Yet another journalist this year was beaten unconscious while covering a political rally, and then beaten further as he lay limp on the ground by a gang of plainclothes police officers. This attack was even captured on video. And not only were charges never brought against the officers, the victim was later pressured by authorities to accept blame for the attack himself. Sadly, I could go on and on like this, to say nothing of the many unsolved murders. Russia's beleaguered political opposition fares no better than its journalists. I've met a few times this year with former Deputy Prime Minister Boris Nemtsov, who organizes peaceful political rallies to protest the lack of democracy in Russia, as is their right under the Russian Constitution. But these rallies are often targeted and violently broken up by Russian authorities. And then there's the sad, ongoing saga of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, whose company was stolen from him, who has languished in jail for 7 years. When his sentence expired recently, new charges were manufactured against him. He's not being tried by a jury, just a single judge. And the political fix has been in for a long time. He could now face up to 12 more years in prison if ever there was a case of legal nihilism, of an affront to the very values of equal justice that we hold dear. The case of Khodorkovsky is it. The same can be said about the case of Sergei Magnitsky, a tax attorney for an American investor who uncovered the theft by Russian officials of $230 million from the Russian treasury. Because of Magnitsky's relentless investigation into this corruption, agents of the Russian Interior Ministry eventually threw him in jail to silence him. He was deprived of clean water, left in a freezing cell for days, and denied medical care. After 358 days of this abuse, Sergei Magnitsky died. He was 37. Not only has the Russian government held no one accountable, several officials connected to Magnitsky's imprisonment and murder received commendations. Cases like this make a mockery of the idea that Russia is governed in any way by the rule of law. And unfortunately, they lead to one of two conclusions. Either President Medvedev tolerates these injustices, or he is incapable of stopping them. When we take the full measure of this Russian government, my friends, I think it calls for a more sober approach to this relationship. We need to begin dealing with Russia more as the modest power it is, not the great power it once was. And in part, that means being more assertive in the defense of our interests and values. For starters, we need to resume the sale of defensive arms to Georgia. Our allies in Central and Eastern Europe view Georgia as a test case of whether the United States will stand by them or not. Russia views Georgia as a test case too, of how much it can get away with in Georgia, and if they're then elsewhere. It is the policy of our government to support Georgia's aspiration to join NATO. And yet for 2 years, out of deference to Russia, the administration has not authorized defensive arms sales to Georgia. This has to change. At a minimum, we should provide Georgia with early warning radars and other basic capabilities to strengthen its defenses. Second, on the question of values, the U.S.-Russia Working Group on Human Rights is led on the Russian side by one of Putin's closest allies and ideologists. Until this individual is replaced by a credible Russian voice on human rights, the administration should immediately cut off its participation in this bogus exercise. Third, Congress should build on the legislation that Senator Ben Cardin and I introduced, which imposes sanctions and travel bans on those responsible for the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, and expand these measures to other Russian officials who are complicit in human rights violations. We should also block their families from traveling to, studying, and vacationing in the United States. This would be a good first step in imposing some very personal costs on the most corrupt officials. Fourth, we need to make clear to the Russian government that if its behavior does not continue to improve on matters of our concern, including human rights and the rule of law, it will jeopardize its chances to get what it wants most from us. I'm not opposed in principle to Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization, especially since it would benefit many hardworking Russians. That said, the WTO is a rules-based organization, and those rules will not be bent or broken for Russia. And lest anyone forget, the U.S. Congress has a say in this matter, since we would have to repeal the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to consummate the agreement. Ultimately, we need a national debate about the real nature of this Russian government, about what kind of relationship is possible with this government, and about the place that Russia should realistically occupy in U.S. foreign policy. Russia's WTO accession offers a chance to have that debate. Some may want to avoid it, but Congress should use its power to force that debate to happen. As I have said today, I believe we need greater realism about Russia, but that is not the same as pessimism or cynicism or demonization. I am an optimist, even about Russia, and I often find sources for hope in the most hopeless of places. Mikhail Khodorkovsky has languished in prison for 7 years. Next week, he will almost certainly be forced to endure many more. And yet, in a final appeal to the man in whose hands his fate rests, Khodorkovsky had this to say, and I quote, "I will not be exaggerating if I say that millions of eyes throughout all of Russia and throughout the world are watching for the outcome of this trial. They are watching with the hope that Russia will after all become a country of freedom and of the law, where supporting opposition parties will cease being a cause for reprisals, where the special services will protect the people and the law, and not the bureaucracy from the people and the law, where human rights will no longer depend on the mood of the czar, good or evil, where on the contrary, the power will truly be dependent on the citizens and the court, only on law and God. For me, As for anybody, it's hard to live in jail, and I do not want to die there, but I have to. I will not hesitate. The things I believe in are worth dying for. That there are still men and women of such spirit in Russia is cause for hope. And eventually, maybe not this year or next year or the year after that, but eventually, these Russians will occupy their rightful place as the leaders of their nation. For equal justice can be delayed and human dignity can be denied, but not forever. Thank you very much.
Senator McCain has agreed to take questions and answers as well, and I think we have about 20 minutes for that. Is there someone who would like to pose the first question? I see it right there next to you, Nicholas.
Senator McCain, Andrew Nagorski, East-West Institute, thank you very much for that presentation. I agree that a debate on all this is well worthwhile. I did want to ask you, though, particularly about your ideas for Georgia and new defense weaponry there. One of the discussions after what happened last time was, what if Georgia had been a member of NATO? What would NATO have done? And if we begin to, how far would the U.S. and NATO commitment go to Georgia if it begins to rearm Georgia now? Thank you.
First of all, I think that we ought to emphasize that what Georgia needs is defensive weaponry. As you know, it's still not totally clear who did what and who started what and what exactly the train of events that took place. I think there is agreement that it was a overreaction, to say the least, on Russians' part, and this business of recognizing South Ossetia and Abkhazia as sovereign nations is an affront to every norm of international behavior that we stand for and believe in. So I emphasize that it should be defensive weaponry and not weaponry that could, under any scenario, be used to inflict or be a cause for conflict. I think that I could argue with you that if Georgia were a member of NATO, as our Baltic countries are, then it would be a great deterrent to further Russian aggression in Georgia. And I know that you could interpret that to some degree to brinksmanship, but as I said in my prepared remarks, if Russia believes that they can go in and occupy 20% of Georgian territory and do so with impunity and carry out all of the operations they're doing now, ethnic cleansing, issuing passports, and with their good friends from Nicaragua, and I'm trying to think of the other country that recognized South Ossetia. And,
well, Hamas did.
Yeah, there you go. But I think the root of this, too, though, is that for us to say that this is not acceptable behavior for a country that wants to be part of the community of nations. And so I would be very careful about the weaponry that I sponsored to be sold to Georgia. I would be very careful in making it clear to the Russians that none of these weapons could be used in an offensive fashion. But I also would make it clear that I think the Georgians also have the right to at least have some way of defending themselves if they somehow aggravate Vladimir Putin again. It is well known that Vladimir Putin detests Misha Saakashvili. So all I can say is I think it has to be done very carefully. But for us to sit still and watch what's going on in Georgia is really an affront to not only our standards of behavior, but international standards of behavior. I hope that responded to your comment.
Okay,
question.
This table here in the center. Pass the mic over.
Senator McCain, many thanks for your speech. It was very strong in consequences, and we have a lot of things to work on. My name is Pavel Fischer. I'm from Prague, Czech Republic. I'm political director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Recently, we had Astana summit for OSCE organization. The Astana summit didn't deliver. We wished to have an action plan, we wished to have a political declaration, and we left Astana just with a commemorative statement. This is a very important point because OSCE itself has a very strong legacy in terms of values. And we didn't work with this legacy, we just accepted a commemorative statement. And sometimes from Moscow we hear that they would like to launch new initiatives and new organizations for security cooperation in Europe. What's your reading? How to work in this frame with the old ones whose legacy is not exploited at its value, or launch new initiatives? Thank you very much.
Well, I'm always in favor of new initiatives that could lead to greater cooperation and advancement in the causes that are principles and what we stand for and believe in. I might make an argument that we have lots of organizations. There's an alphabet soup of organizations that meet regularly in very nice places, and I enjoy going to those meetings as well. I recommend Scottsdale, Arizona as one of them. So I'm not sure that it's a matter of more organization as it is national will and behavior. Will another organization cause the Russians to leave South Ossetia and Abkhazia? I'm not sure. But I also do not want to diminish the role of many of these organizations. I'd like to mention, for example, a recent NATO meeting in Lisbon. I thought it was a good meeting. I thought there were some agreements made. I thought that the President pointed out, President of the United States pointed out, President Obama, that our commitment in Afghanistan, I thought was a very important statement that he made, and I applaud it. And so I'm not diminishing the role of these organizations. I would just like to see the existing ones become more effective. And by the way, we welcome Russia into our discussions in NATO. We are not excluding Russia, nor are there secret plans going on to somehow isolate or harm Russia. But I do think it's of some interest, for example, that Russia has moved many of its tactical nuclear weapons closer to the borders of Europe. What's the reason for that? I'd be very interested. I hope I responded to your question.
If I may add on, Pavel and I had a chance to talk at dinner last night, and I think one of the things about the reset policy is the belief or the desire to improve the relationship so that you smooth tensions, but that can have the effect of also not confronting the issues of values of principle. The contrast is if you confront the confront the issues of principle, you end up with a much more conflictual relationship. How do you get the balance there?
Well, I think, in some ways we go back to fundamentals. The fundamental beliefs that we have, the fundamental and I think most important statement ever made in recent history is that all of us are created equal, all of us, and endowed with certain inalienable rights. It's kind of interesting to me that we may be taking up, it's very likely, taking up the New START Treaty on the floor of the United States Senate next week. And I'm hopeful, frankly, that we could reach agreements with people like my colleague John Kyle, who knows more about nuclear inventory modernization than anybody in America because he's been studying them for 25 years, and I hope we can resolve the missile defense issues. But it may take place during that debate on START, will take place the same day Khodorkovsky is sentenced to another 10 or 12 years in prison. There's a certain disconnect there that I find a bit disturbing. So we want to move forward, with our relationship with the Russians and make it better and do many things with them. And I'm all for those. But at the same time, we see these human rights abuses, and apparently a judge, everybody knows the fix is in, will sentence Khodorkovsky to another 7, 10, 12 years in prison, and there's very little doubt that that's tantamount to a death sentence. So there's a certain contradiction there that I think has to be bridged if we're going to have a totally global relationship with Russia.
Okay, we had one more at this center table, and then we'll go to the back there.
Will Amatruda. Senator, you mentioned that for Russia to become a member of the World Trade Organization, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment would have to be repealed. But a number of months ago at the Wilson Center, Richard Pearl, who was Senator Jackson's staffer at the time it was drafted, and probably said that repeal would not be necessary because it applies to non-market economies, and he felt that now the only non-market economies still in the world are North Korea and Cuba. How would you respond?
Well, let me just say I have the greatest respect for Richard Pearl, and I've known him and have been a friend for many years. I just don't think that that is the general interpretation. I think that it is accepted by most that repeal of Jackson-Vanik. And it isn't just relations with Russia, as you know, that Jackson-Vanik is holding up. It's with some other countries as well that we need to repeal it. So, because of our relations with other countries. So I believe that it's just, and I'd be glad to go back and research it some more in light of Richard's opinion and examine it. But everything that I've been told and my knowledge is that that's part of the deal. It has to be repealed. Thank you. I'll go back and look at it. In fact, I'll call up Richard myself.
Okay, here on the back right.
Erica Marat, Voice of America, Russian Service. I wonder, when do you think START treaty will be ratified, and what role did Reset play in signing the treaty? Thanks.
I'm hopeful that we could get it done before we go out of session. I don't think it's vital that we do it before we go out of session. We are crowded with, as you know, taxes, spending. As you know, there's a great deal of controversy over the latest agreement on taxes, and being a snob, I don't pay that close attention to what goes on in the House of Representatives, but apparently from media reports, there is some kind of a revolt going on. How serious that is, I'm not sure. But I'd also like to point out, I think that START is very important, okay? And I would like to see it ratified. But I would also point out to you that the last election, last November 2nd, wasn't about START. It wasn't even about Afghanistan or Iraq. It was about 9.8% unemployment, jobs and jobs and jobs in the economy. So the message of the election is, either rightly or wrongly, but we are responsive to the people that are our citizenry, is that they want our attention on the economy. And so that's why we Republicans have said we are not opposed to bringing up START, but we want to address the spending and the taxes issue. Now, apparently we are moving forward on that. Hopefully on Monday, there will be a quote, continuing resolution, and I won't bother with all the arcane stuff about that, but it is very possible, and I'm not the leader, and I don't set the agendas, but I do think it's possible that you could see two-track. On one side, the spending issue and finishing up on the taxes, and on the other side at the same time, addressing the START treaty. And I want to emphasize that is could, and that is up to the majority leader of the Senate, not up to me. But I think it's very possible that you could see that scenario.
Here in the red tie.
Senator McCain, Jacek Przywódzki, Polish Republic Daily. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said lately that Poland was stripped of illusions about the nature of relations between the US and Poland. I wonder, what is your opinion on Barack Obama's policy towards Poland?
Well, I think the relationship is excellent. I think the president is committed to continued close relations with Poland. I think that frankly, I do not know of a single member of Congress that doesn't want us to see, by the way, that expresses our sorrow over the great tragedy of the plane crash and our sympathy for the people of Poland. But we are very close. You know, we have had, thank God, throughout our history, waves of immigrants who have come to our country. There is still a very, very strong attachment on the part of Polish Americans to Poland, and the diaspora here is very, very strong. So I do not see any, not only no impediments, but I see a very strong and close relationship. And some of that may translate into our joint efforts on issues such as missile defense.
Okay, on this side we have it.
My name is Yela De Franceschi from VOA. This conference is devoted to forging a transatlantic consensus on Russia.
I think could you move? Yeah.
Yes, this conference is dedicated to forging or discussing how to forge a transatlantic consensus on Russia. And you just sort of displayed your vision of U.S.-Russia relations. Do the U.S. Atlantic partners have a similar view of Russia and similar criticism of its internal policies, as well as foreign policy?
Do the allies have a common view?
I think that to a greater or lesser degree, our allies do. Our British friends are still deeply concerned about the assassination that took place in London, as you know. I think that the closer you are to having had an experience with Russia, the more closely aligned that people are with my remarks. I refer specifically to the Baltic countries. But I also think that, and maybe this isn't exactly on the subject of your question, that people in Europe and the world are watching very carefully what happens in Ukraine, what happens in Belarus, and also what happens in Georgia. A lot of us who were very supportive of the Orange Revolution have been disappointed at the failure of the, shall we say, progressive elements within Ukraine to have worked together. We're very concerned to see what the new administration in Ukraine does. We are very concerned about what happens in the future with Georgia, particularly at a time perhaps after the START Treaty is ratified, after Russia is a member of the WTO. And so I think that the concerns are shared by our European friends, but to a greater or lesser degree, and each individual nation has its own leadership and views. But I do believe that the closer you have been to had an experience with the former Soviet Union, the more skepticism there seems to be.
Thank you.
Okay, here in the front, Charles Gotti, professor here at SAIS, and the 56er.
Thanks very much. Charles Gotti, I teach here at SAIS. Senator, I think maybe most Russian specialists in this country would share your skeptical but very realistic view, and I was particularly impressed by your discussion of the domestic scene in Russia. My question, even though you said that you don't like to discuss that other chamber in Congress, but the new Republican majority includes dozens and dozens of Tea Party types whose views about the outside world is either unknown perhaps to them, but certainly to us. What do you expect them to do in the next couple of years, maybe with respect to Russia or any other foreign policy issue?
First of all, my friends, what you really saw in the last election was a peaceful revolt. I don't say revolution because revolutions last and have lasting impact. It's not clear to me yet how long the Tea Party influence and to what intensity it will remain. I think that'll depend to a large degree on how much they feel, the average citizens feel, that we have satisfied many of their concerns. That obviously translates into an improving economy. And by the way, these Tea Party people are average citizens who had never been involved in the political environment before. I have met with Tea Party people that I've asked time after time, how many of you never went to a political event before? Almost always, most of them would say that they never had. So this really was a grassroots revolt out there. And obviously their attention was on the domestic issues. When you go to Yuma, Arizona, and there's 23% unemployment, they're not that interested. START doesn't come up in the conversation. It just is a reality. And one of the reasons why I worry about our economy is obviously how it translates in our ability to protect our national security interests. And I'm sorry for the long answer, but I don't think that the majority of Tea Partiers have thought a lot about the START Treaty or some of the issues that we face. Even the war in Afghanistan and Iraq did not come up in this last election as a significant issue. By the way, neither did a lot of the social issues, such as abortion and issues such gay marriage, things like that. It was all about the economy and the economy and the economy. So, and by the way, some of the newer members of the Senate, like Rob Portman and Mark Kirk and Dan Coates, our former ambassador to Germany. I mean, there's some very experienced and talented people that have come to as new members of the United States Senate as well. Where I worry about this movement is that they want to cut spending. They want spending cut. They want to stop the spending. That's one of the first things that they want. And what I worry about is cuts in things like foreign aid that there's really never been any real constituency for to start with, that across the board cuts could affect foreign aid, defense, etc. That is my concern. Not that there's a huge isolationist movement associated with the Tea Partiers, but that there's just this overwhelming desire and concern about mortgaging our children's futures, which is certainly legitimate. So that's my concern about this new group in the House of Representatives.
Okay, we had, I'm going to go with Mike Holtzel here, and I think we're going to be having to wrap up shortly.
Can I
after.
do two more?
Sure,
Yeah,
do two more.
Mike Halsall, Center for Transatlantic Relations. Thank you, Senator, for your statement. And
Thank you, and
your years of
might
service.
mention we have known each other for more than a quarter of a century.
Yes,
since
sir.
you worked for Senator Biden many years ago.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'd like to get back to the issue of our European allies, if I might. Several weeks ago, there was a meeting in Deauville, leaders of France, Germany, and Russia, and one idea that reportedly came out of the meeting was that Russia be given a seat in European Union Security Committee. Perhaps in return, Russia would move forward on fulfilling its commitment that it made 11 years ago to evacuate Transnistria. I wonder what you think about the idea of Russia getting into that.
Some people, when we see these various proposals about including Russia in certain organizations and certain discussions, things, people seem to, oh my God, this could be disastrous, and I don't necessarily think so. And I think we should adopt a view that we want Russia included in discussions that we might have that might be helpful throughout the world. I mentioned in my remarks the fact that the Russians are now letting us run supplies through Russia into Afghanistan is helpful. The fact that they have not sold missiles to Iran is helpful. In those areas where we can be helpful, we want to be helpful. And if being in discussions in certain organizations or certain ad hoc groups, none of that bothers me much. What bothers me is what the thrust of my remarks were about. How can you be a respected member of any real international organization if you are carrying out a government, or if you have a government that is abusing human rights, that is not respecting the rule of law, that is, when you look at their gradings on literally everything, corruption, transparency, whatever it is, they continue to decline every single year. And anybody that believe what was in WikiLeaks, one of the cables described Russia in a very graphic kind of fashion. I've forgotten the exact wording.
Mafia state?
Yeah, mafia state or something like that. And I'm not sure I agree with that characterization. But in order to be a contributing member of the international community, and someday, maybe next year, we'll come back and talk about China, because clearly China is not living up to the expectations that we had that China would exercise as the world's great economic power, either one or two, depending on who you talk to or what year you're talking about. But so it's you know, a lot of us here will always have an enduring respect and admiration and appreciation for one Ronald Reagan, by the one that they called the cowboy, the inexperienced governor of California who had no knowledge or background on international issues and security. Fundamentally, he believed, and I think our founding fathers believed, and it has guided us, is we first have to advocate for and respect for, not entirely, but certainly a pillar over time, is the fundamental belief that all of us are endowed with certain inalienable rights, no matter where we live. And right now, the Russians are depriving Russian people of that. And that has to play not the overriding consideration, but certainly a consideration in our relations with Russia and how we include them or exclude them or how we treat them. And I am not advocating a confrontation with Russia. I am not advocating a renewal of the Cold War, which would be impossible anyway. But I am advocating for the principles that, in the words of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. That we should be more adhering to those principles. And I think that applies in our relationship with China. I think it applies to our relations with Iran. And I think it applies in our relations with Russia as well. Can we do one more?
Sure. And before I do that, let me just pull you out further on that. So does accommodation of a strategic relationship with Russia actually come at the expense of Russian people?
I hope not. I hope not. What I hope is that we can get the START Treaty done. And this will help U.S.-Russia relations. It will help reduce the nuclear inventory. By the way, this assertion that somehow a START treaty will dissuade North Korea, Iran, and other countries from wanting to acquire nuclear weapons, well, the first other START treaties certainly didn't restrain Iran or North Korea or other countries from acquiring nuclear weapons, so that's just foolishness. But it is probably a good thing. So I guess what I'm saying, Kurt, is that they cannot be, we have to make progress where we can, stand back where we need to, support our allies, but fundamentally, whether it be the demonstrators in the streets of Tehran, as we watch a young woman bleed to death in the street named Neda, or whether it be Khodorkovsky, or whether it be those who are being held in prison without really any real reason for them to be in prison, we have to stand up for them. That's not only an ideal that is worth advocating, but it is an ideal that has underlined our behavior, and it is an ideal that has succeeded adherence to it.
Okay, one here, and then I think we'll have to let you go.
Thank you. I'm Laure Mandeville from the French daily newspaper Le Figaro. Senator McCain, we're just talking about Europe and Russia, and the WikiLeaks publications recently underline the worry of US diplomats about the relationship between Berlusconi and Putin, and the underlying energy dubious relationship between the two countries as well. Would you comment on that? Are you worried as well?
I'm very worried about the effect of WikiLeaks. One area, obviously, is the diplomatic cables and that stuff we have been talking about. And maybe the information itself is not so disturbing to many, but when's the next time that one of our friends or allies, leaders, is going to have a frank conversation with anybody? I mean, really. And friends, the great thing about friends is they do have frank conversations, and it's really damaging. The other thing that's terribly damaging, of course, is the revelation of Iraqis and Afghans who were cooperating with us. It literally will, if it hasn't already, cost people their lives. I mean, that is a terrible thing to happen. And so the WikiLeaks thing, however, is part of a very broader and more significant challenge that we talk about it, and we've begun to talk about it. It's begun to appear in the media and in the Senate, in the Armed Services Committee, and on the Homeland Security Committee. We've started to talk about it some. But this whole issue of cyber war is a huge issue. But I also want to know, how in the world does a private first class have access to cables that are the highest level exchanges between the President of the United States and other world leaders? That is crazy. And you know what? There has no one been held responsible in the whole chain of command yet, except for this one private first class. Now, if there is ever a classic example of everyone is responsible, so therefore no one is responsible, this is it. Now, who was it? Who was his superior? Who was it that he that said, "Oh, he's only listening to Lady Gaga"? I mean, if you wrote a book, nobody would read it because it's so bizarre. And so, but the larger issue here is you can apparently. I only know what I read, okay, and I'm not getting any secret information out. Can we shut down entire weapons systems? Can we shut down are enemies able to shut down our entire computerized systems of information and knowledge and carrying out certain plans or courses of action? Is this, I mean, it is very, 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 very serious. And we're going to have to get on this issue, and maybe 10 years from now, we may look back on the WikiLeaks thing as a catalyst to action to start addressing this real serious threat to our national security. And not only ours, but every other nation, frankly, of all of our friends and allies, as well as our adversaries. A small footnote, my campaign was hacked into by the Chinese. Now, they must have had a very boring experience as they got all that trash and trivia that went back and forth. And but maybe, and they also learned how to lose a presidential campaign as well. So anyway, so thank you very much. Thank you, Kurt.